the nuclear plane that almost ended aviation forever. A deep metallic roar shakes the desert floor. Above, a massive bomber cuts through the sky, carrying something far more dangerous than bombs, a live nuclear reactor. Scientists in white suits watch nervously from bunkers miles away as the aircraft circles overhead. They've actually done it. The US Air Force has flown a nuclear-powered plane, even if only for a moment. But this isn't fiction, it really happened. And while America was doing this, the Soviet Union was scheming to beat them to the same terrifying goal, a plane that could fly forever. It was the ultimate Cold War fantasy, endless range, unstoppable power, and possibly the fastest way to end civilization. This is the story of the nuclear plane that almost ended aviation forever. A story so bizarre it flips between brilliance, paranoia, and dark comedy. Because in the Cold War, humanity didn't just test bombs, we tested common sense. The Cold War, fever dream. In the uneasy calm after World War II, two new superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, glared across a divided world. Both had atomic bombs, and both were terrified of falling behind. Fear became the great motivator, and one word seemed to promise the answer to every worry: nuclear. By the late 1940s, nuclear meant progress and power at once. It lit up propaganda screens and haunted public imagination. If atomic energy could light cities and sink submarines, why not make it fly? The idea of an airplane that never needed to land felt like a miracle until you remembered what it carried. In theory, the pitch was seductively simple. A nuclear-powered plane could roam the skies for days or weeks, impossible to intercept and always ready to strike. If one side achieved it, the other could never rest. That insecurity set the stage for a race built on mutual paranoia. In the United States, it took shape as the aircraft nuclear propulsion program. In the Soviet Union, it emerged under other names within the Tupolev Design Bureau. Both chased the same fantasy: infinite range, ultimate deterrence, zero restraint. Politicians on both sides sold the dream as strength. In America, safety drills and shimmering newsreels turned nuclear power into patriotic showmanship. In the USSR, propaganda films promised a glorious atomic future. Somewhere between pride and fear, the line between progress and recklessness disappeared. The same idea that promised peace also threatened annihilation if even one wing failed. Across deserts in New Mexico and frozen steppes in Kazakhstan, scientists tested the same madness from opposite horizons. Each side imagined the other was already ahead. Each was wrong. What neither admitted aloud was the simplest truth of all: every machine that flies must someday fall, and when your engine is a reactor, falling isn't an option. They didn't know it yet, but the coming experiments would bring them perilously close to finding out how far that fall could go. The American nuclear plane program begins. The United States didn't just dream of the nuclear airplane, it actually tried to build one. The program had an official name, the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Initiative, or ANP. To those who worked on it, it was equal parts engineering marvel and occupational hazard. Created in the early 195s under the joint sponsorship of the Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission, ANP promised to deliver a plane that could roam the globe non-stop, refueling only on coffee and optimism. At its core, ANP pursued two main paths. One aimed to design a real nuclear-powered jet engine that could heat incoming air directly with a reactor. The other, more cautious path, focused on simply putting a working reactor in the air to see what would happen. That second one sounded safer on paper until it came time to actually do it. The result was a modified B-36 bomber named the NB-36H Crusader. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a flying laboratory for humankind's overconfidence. From the outside, the Crusader looked like a standard bomber, sleek, silvery, and menacingly huge. Inside, it was a different story. The bomb bay had been replaced with a small nuclear reactor. Engineers called it the test reactor, though there was nothing small about it except the amount of shielding that separated it from the pilots. The idea was to study how radiation behaved in flight, how it scattered through the fuselage, and whether a nuclear aircraft could ever be made safe. The answer would soon become apparent. Radiation shielding was a nightmare. To protect the six-person crew from exposure, engineers essentially built a bunker inside the cockpit. They lined it with 12 tons of lead and rubber, creating what looked like a futuristic cave on wings. The windshield was made from 18 inches of leaded glass. The joke among the crew was that if the plane ever had to make an emergency landing, no one would see the runway in time. Too much protection, not enough visibility. Still, the Air Force needed data, and the Crusader was humanity's bravest, or most expendable, test subject. Each flight carried a certain grim tension. Before takeoff, teams in white coats and Geiger counters checked for leaks and tightened bolts that no one wanted to wiggle loose. The reactor wasn't actually connected to the engines, it wasn't powering the plane, but it was live, humming with fission inside its shielded pod. As the engines roared and the plane lifted from the desert tarmac, everyone on the ground knew exactly what was at stake. If anything went wrong, the crash site would glow for 100,000 years. The test routes were carefully selected over sparsely populated areas of Texas and New Mexico. Even then, residents occasionally spotted the enormous silver bomber and wondered why it flew escorted by fighter jets that never let it out of sight. The answer was simple. If the nuclear plane went down, those fighters were the first line of cleanup, a job nobody wanted. Inside the cockpit, crew members worked in tight quarters, surrounded by shielding that trapped heat and blocked most radio signals. Communication was difficult, and so was breathing. Air circulated through filters while dosimeters clipped to their suits clicked constantly. At first, the background radiation level seemed acceptable. After just a few flights, however, instruments showed trace contamination in areas that were supposed to be sealed. No one said the quiet part out loud. They were sitting feet away from an active reactor 30,000 feet above the ground. The Air Force logbooks describe a series of 50-odd flights between 1955 and 1957. Officially, all went according to plan. Unofficially, engineers were alarmed by how unpredictable the readings were. Radiation didn't behave like fuel or thrust, it behaved like a stubborn ghost, sneaking through microscopic seams, bouncing around compartments, and refusing to stay put. Shielding could be increased, but every extra pound of protection meant less lift, less range, less logic behind the idea of a plane that could supposedly fly forever. Meanwhile, secrecy cloaked everything. Newspapers reported vague hints of nuclear flight experiments, though details remained buried under security classifications. Even among those working on the project, few saw the complete picture. Technicians handling reactor components were told only enough to do their part. Exposure reports were filed privately. In an era when nuclear enthusiasm was patriotic, admitting fear felt like treason. The culture of the time rewarded optimism and punished doubt. Congressional committees toured the facilities, dazzled by models of atomic engines mounted on polished stands. Generals spoke of strategic supremacy, of planes that would never need to land. Nobody wanted to be the one pointing out that if such a plane crashed, there might not be a country left to defend. Test pilots joked through their nerves with gallows humor. They'd walk out to the plane saying, "Let's hope today's weather holds and the uranium stays inside." The engineers kept battling the same equation, weight versus safety. To shield the entire aircraft effectively would require several hundred tons of lead, more than the plane could possibly lift. Reducing the shielding meant higher radiation doses for everyone aboard and potential contamination of everything below the flight path. It was like trying to design a campfire that wouldn't burn anything while roasting marshmallows with a flamethrower. Despite the flaws, ANP's momentum continued. Defense contractors competed for contracts, each promising lighter, more efficient reactors. Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, and Convair all joined the atomic gold rush. Laboratories in Ohio and Idaho worked day and night, building test cores and experimental heat exchangers. Every small improvement rekindled hope that the impossible might still be just barely possible. After all, if the Soviets managed it first, America would look weak, a risk politicians refused to accept. By the late 50s, internal reviews told a different story. The costs were astronomical, the schedule unrealistic, and the risk uncontainable. Even if they could perfect the engine, how would they test an aircraft powered by an unshielded reactor without irradiating half the planet? No one had a satisfying answer. Some suggested launching it from remote islands or keeping it over the ocean, but crashes still happen. The dream of endless flight was colliding with the messy reality of gravity. Still, the story wasn't over. Buried inside the ANP reports were ideas that in hindsight make the nuclear bomber look almost sane. Concepts like a missile powered by a reactor, capable of flying indefinitely and dropping hydrogen bombs one after another, started floating through laboratories. The thinking was, if putting people next to a nuclear engine is too risky, maybe remove the people. let the weapon fly itself. It sounded efficient, also horrifying. By the time the NB-36H Crusader was mothballed, it had proved one undeniable fact. Flying with a reactor was possible, but surviving it long-term was not. The engineers had their data, the Air Force had its proof, and the scientific community had its doubts confirmed. Yet instead of using that as a stopping point, planners saw a doorway to something even more extreme. One classified memo described the next step as a nuclear-powered cruise missile with unlimited range. That proposal would evolve into Project Pluto, a creation so outrageous that even the engineers half-joked it existed to test whether ethics had an off switch. The reactor plane had only flirted with catastrophe. The next program would court it directly. And if you thought a crude bomber carrying a live reactor sounded bad, what came next redefined the word unstoppable in the worst possible way. Inside the reactor, engineering madness. Try to picture a jet engine, multiply its temperature by a few million degrees, and remove every component that resembles sanity. That's more or less what the nuclear engineers of the 195s were attempting. Nuclear propulsion, in theory, was dazzlingly simple. Instead of burning jet fuel, you let atomic fission do the heating. The reactor's core would get so hot that air rushing through the engine would expand violently, shooting out the back and pushing the plane forward. No gasoline, no refueling, just an airborne barbecue running on uranium. On whiteboards, it looked like genius. In real life, it looked like an extinction-level hazard wrapped in metal. A normal jet engine swallows air, compresses it, mixes it with fuel, and ignites it. The explosion creates thrust, and everything repeats thousands of times per second. Replace the burning fuel with the heat of a reactor, and you skip the middleman. It's like running a hairdryer with a volcano instead of electricity. Early designs divided into two main types, one where a conventional turbine circulated heat from the reactor, and another where the incoming air passed directly through the nuclear core. The first avoided radiation leaks but was heavy. The second was lighter, more powerful, and catastrophically unsafe. Engineers debated both over endless chalk dust and coffee. They called the concept direct cycle propulsion, which sounds tidy until you remember that the cycle involved blasting radioactive air directly into the sky. Every molecule of exhaust would carry a gentle glow, not the romantic kind, the emergency evacuation kind. On paper, the direct cycle engine offered incredible efficiency. In practice, it promised a trail of airborne fallout extending along the flight path wherever the plane went. Even the test models on the ground needed elaborate containment domes to keep the desert from becoming a Superfund site. Yet the optimism never fully dimmed. The problem, scientists argued, wasn't the physics, it was the engineering. They convinced themselves that if they could just shrink the reactor core enough, design better shielding, and find materials that didn't melt at 2,000 degrees Celsius, everything would fall into place. But every solution spawned new absurdities. To fit inside a bomber, the reactor had to be miniature, but miniaturization meant higher radiation density. To block that radiation, you added shielding. But weight increased, lift vanished, and the circle of impossibility completed itself. Inside laboratories, mock-ups hummed under thick layers of containment metal. Radiation monitors clicked constantly. Anyone entering the test cell wore a film badge to track exposure, like a personal scoreboard of how close they were to glowing. To cool down components, technicians sometimes used liquid sodium. Great for heat transfer, disastrous when leaked, since it burst into flames on contact with air. The scene could have been mistaken for a steampunk fever dream. Pipes dripping coolant, scientists in lead aprons, dials twitching with invisible energy. When faced with questions about safety, project leaders offered pragmatic optimism. They argued that every new frontier carried risk, that's why it was called a frontier. But privately, the memos sounded less heroic. Reports from Idaho test facilities described unexpected radiological anomalies, a bureaucratic euphemism for dangerous radiation leaks. One engineer later recalled how a single misaligned valve released contaminated air across the workspace. They scrubbed everything down and kept working. It was too early in the Cold War to let caution win. If all this sounds slightly absurd, remember the political background. Funding and jobs depended on showing progress. A reactor that merely glowed safely in a hangar didn't justify billions of dollars. They needed data, airflow patterns, heat gradients, dose rates. So they ran small-scale experiments where superheated radioactive gas whooshed through experimental nozzles. The results looked promising until sensors showed radiation levels that make a Geiger counter sing like a jazz soloist. Publicly, the tests were called encouraging. Privately, they were terrifying. Still, enthusiasm thrived under the banner of national necessity. If we don't do it, the Soviets will, became the unofficial motto. The paradox was that technically, both sides kept assuming the other was farther ahead. Spy reports misinterpreted prototypes as functioning planes, pushing each country to build faster and test harder. What started as a quest for endurance morphed into a contest of who could outrun common sense. The biggest unsolved issue was what happened in the event of a crash. A conventional bomber hitting the ground was tragic but localized. A nuclear-powered bomber breaking apart meant scattering several thousand pounds of radioactive material across miles of landscape. Imagine an emergency response manual that begins with, Step 1, evacuate half the continent. That was the level of absurdity engineers faced whenever they ran simulation. Even accidents on the runway could contaminate personnel, soil, and nearby water sources. And yet, each report seemed to underplay the danger. Every scientist knew the golden rule. The faster you deliver good news, the longer your project stays funded. One internal review brainstormed potential fail-safes. Could the reactor automatically seal itself upon impact? Maybe it could drop into a containment shell midair. One draft even proposed an emergency parachute for the reactor core, a flying coffin slowly descending, humming as it cooled. Nothing workable emerged, mostly because the physics refused to cooperate with optimism. At the end of the day, atoms didn't care about patriotism. By 1958, the technical teams had achieved what bureaucrats called proof of principle. Yes, a nuclear reactor could theoretically power a jet engine. The problem was everyone would die horribly if it did. That line didn't fit easily into a progress report, so they framed it the old-fashioned way: additional research required. Programs were extended, facilities expanded, and test stands multiplied, because admitting defeat cost more politically than radiation ever could. Engineers who truly understood the magnitude of the danger started quitting quietly for safer work, like reactor projects buried in submarines. Naval propulsion, at least, involved heavy shielding and stable water all around. If something went wrong underwater, it stayed relatively contained. In the air, gravity guaranteed chaos. The remaining teams pushed onward, proud, tired, and increasingly aware that they were treading technological quicksand. They tried to innovate their way out using lighter composites and experimental shielding materials. Layers of boron, polyethylene, and tungsten were tested like cosmic onions, each peel aiming to stop another particle. But radiation is sneaky. Neutrons slipped through cracks, reflected off surfaces, and found new paths to leak out. The dream of a perfectly sealed flying reactor drifted farther away with every attempted fix. Somewhere along the way, the pursuit changed tone. What began as patriotic discovery evolved into a grim wager against catastrophe. At government hearings, generals promised success within 5 years. Engineers inside knew those 5 years would bring nothing but fresh ulcers and stronger coffee. One scientist later put it best: every calculation proved the concept could work. Every experiment proved we shouldn't. And yet the project lived on long enough to inspire an even stranger sequel. If a manned reactor plane caused unbearable risk, maybe the answer was to remove the humans entirely. Let a nuclear engine fly an unmanned weapon instead of an aircraft. Robots didn't need shielding or breathing air. They wouldn't mind the radiation. That's how rationalization happens. One problem solved by inventing an even worse one. By the end of the decade, whispers around the laboratories spoke of a missile so powerful it could circle the globe, unleashing constant fury. The crash scenario wouldn't matter because it wasn't supposed to come home at all. Nuclear propulsion, stripped of purpose as transportation, would become a tool of pure destruction. And so, out of the ashes of every failed test run, one monstrous idea rose unchallenged. They called it Project Pluto, a flying reactor designed not to conquer distance, but to erase it. The nuclear airplane had proved human ingenuity could outthink reason. Project Pluto was proof we still wanted to try. Project Pluto, the flying reactor that never stopped. If the nuclear bomber seemed reckless, the next step made it look almost reasonable. Project Pluto wasn't about flight in any familiar sense. It was about creating a weapon that redefined the word overkill. The goal: a missile that never needed to land, never needed refueling, and could cross the planet spewing radiation while dropping hydrogen bombs along the way. It wasn't deterrence anymore. It was apocalypse on autopilot. The weapon had a proper name, the Supersonic Low Altitude Missile, or SLAM, and it sounded precisely as terrifying as it was. The concept came together in 1957 under the U.S. Air Force and the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory at Livermore. If successful, SLAM would carry up to 16 nuclear warheads and travel at 3 times the speed of sound, hugging the ground at treetop level to dodge radar. Inside its lengthy fuselage sat the beating heart of the project. A ramjet engine powered not by kerosene or fuel, but by an unshielded nuclear reactor roaring at thousands of degrees. A ramjet, in theory, is brutally simple. You use the plane's own speed to compress incoming air, heat it, and blast it out the tail for thrust. Replace conventional combustion with uranium fission, and you have a missile that can fly for days or weeks without stopping. The Air Force loved that part. Unlimited range meant they could launch from anywhere, circle the globe multiple times, and strike on command. The problem was everything else. The engineers quickly realized they were inventing a weapon that polluted the planet as it flew. Because the reactor had no shielding, every second of flight meant streaming hot radioactive gases into the atmosphere. The missile would leave behind an invisible trail of contamination wherever it went, an airborne Chernobyl decades before anyone knew that name. Livermore physicists privately joked that the Earth itself was its real target. The humor was dark, because nobody could fully admit how unethical the concept was, even to each other. On paper, the performance numbers looked impossible to ignore. The projected range was over 100,000 miles, enough to orbit the planet several times. It could carry 50,000 pounds of nuclear ordnance, making even the heaviest bombers look dainty by comparison. Each SLAM could cover multiple strike points across the Soviet Union, then crash into a final target with its own last thermonuclear detonation. The term overcapacity didn't apply. This was the military-industrial version of a nervous breakdown. Yet, despite the moral absurdity, the project gathered momentum. Livermore's site in Nevada became a testing ground for the new nuclear ramjet engine, codenamed Tory. Engineers built massive concrete bunkers and miles of underground piping to simulate high-speed airflow. The first working core, Tory IIA, was tested in 1961. It performed for a few seconds, just long enough to roar, glow, and remind everyone that they were messing with something better suited for a science fiction villain. When Tory IIC followed 2 years later, the monster came to life more convincingly. On a spring day in 1964, engineers at Jackass Flats, yes, that was the real name of the test range, brought the engine online. As the air compressors flooded the ramjet with oxygen and the uranium fuel began to fission, the desert trembled. Witnesses described an ear-splitting howl, the kind of deep mechanical scream that makes your chest vibrate. The engine produced its predicted thrust. In pure physics terms, it was a triumph. In moral terms, it was an unmitigated disaster. The reactor heated air to thousands of degrees, blasting it out the exhaust nozzles in a torrent of invisible radiation. Even though it sat bolted to the ground, everyone present knew that if it ever went airborne, nothing beneath its flight path would stay untainted. Every cow, crop, and breath of air could become slightly radioactive. One technician later said that just standing near the test stand felt wrong, like staring at a volcano you accidentally built. The Air Force, balancing patriotism with denial, kept calling it feasible. Some even argued that since a nuclear war would already blanket the planet with fallout, the SLAM's extra pollution wouldn't matter. That logic did little to reassure the people expected to operate or clean up after it. Despite efficient containment on test days, small particles of activated dust still escaped the site. The desert winds did the rest. Officially, everything stayed within safe limit. Unofficially, engineers went home smelling faintly of ozone and guilt. What truly made Project Pluto chilling was how strategic necessity overpowered ethics. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction meant both sides sought weapons that guaranteed annihilation even after being attacked. SLAM was the perfect manifestation of that idea, indestructible, autonomous, merciless. If Soviet missiles wiped out America's silos, the Pluto missiles could still launch and erase the enemy in return. That made it, on paper, the ultimate deterrent. The catch was simple. It could also end civilization by existing. Decision-makers seemed caught between fascination and dread. President Kennedy's advisors joked nervously about the flying reactor, but they kept funding it. Congress approved budgets with patriotic speeches about technological supremacy, as if radiation was a symbol of freedom. Livermore scientists, meanwhile, struggled with the psychological burden of success. To build a machine that worked perfectly meant creating something fundamentally evil. Each design challenge bordered on absurd. How do you test flight performance without irradiating the sky? One proposal suggested launching slams over the South Pacific and letting them circle until fuel exhaustion. Another wanted to guide them over remote Arctic regions before self-destructing in midair. The problem was the fuel exhaustion part. There was no fuel to run out of. A nuclear engine doesn't stop until it melts. The project's theoretical solutions all concluded with variations of hope it crashes in the ocean. Even handling the missile on the ground was nightmarish. Assembly crews would be exposed to neutron flux within minutes. Maintenance required robotic arms and remote cranes. The launchers needed reinforced silos capable of venting radioactive exhaust into containment systems. Every safety measure canceled out the supposed simplicity that made SLAM appealing. The longer the project went on, the more it looked like trying to weaponize natural disaster. Still, Cold War competition blazed like a fever. Rumors circulated that the Soviets had their own nuclear-powered cruise missile in development. Whether those rumors were true didn't matter. They kept Pluto alive. Scientists spoke cautiously in public, claiming progress was promising. In private, many admitted the weapon's biggest flaw wasn't technical, it was philosophical. A system designed to fly eternally and contaminate everything it touched couldn't exist in a world that intended to survive. By mid-1964, the contradictions became too heavy to ignore. The Cuban Missile Crisis had proved how close humanity could come to destruction by mere misunderstanding. Public sentiment toward nuclear experiments had shifted from awe to anxiety. Environmental concerns were creeping into mainstream debate. Inside closed-door meetings, Air Force generals confessed that the program's cost alone, nearly $250 million, no longer made sense when intercontinental ballistic missiles offered simpler, cleaner deterrent. Still, intelligence officers weren't ready to close the door. What if termination meant falling behind? That paranoia lingered even as the scientists prepared their final reports. They described the tests as conclusive in validating nuclear-powered propulsion for sustained flight, but carefully avoided recommending deployment. The translation: yes, we built a flying reactor, and no sane person wants to see it in the sky. The final decision came quietly. In July 1964, the same year Tory IIC had screamed over Jackass Flats, Project Pluto was cancelled. Official reasons cited changing strategic needs. The real reason was obvious. Someone finally acknowledged that an unshielded nuclear engine flying at Mach 3 over inhabited continents might be an objectively horrible plan. Technically, they called it a suspension. Practically, it was an exorcism. No test flights were ever conducted beyond the stand trials. The SLAM missile existed only as mock-ups, blueprints, and a chilling what-if. For the engineers who had poured years into the project, the cancellation landed somewhere between relief and melancholy. They'd proven astonishing things about high-temperature materials, reactor design, and supersonic aerodynamics, yet no one could cheer. One physicist compared it to discovering the recipe for poison gas when you set out to invent perfume. The data collected from Pluto would quietly inform safer nuclear technologies for space exploration later. But the weapon itself was sealed away as a national embarrassment. Even decades later, the ghost of Project Pluto keeps resurfacing. Every few years, a headline bursts out about new nuclear-powered missiles or endless-range drones. Analysts recognize the DNA immediately. Russia's recent 9M730 Burevestnik reportedly borrows the same principles. It's as if humanity can't resist reopening Pandora's reactor. Looking back, Project Pluto stands as the purest expression of Cold War logic, limitless ambition fused with limitless fear. It delivered on every promise of technological wonder and simultaneously revealed our worst impulses. The engineers built exactly what they were asked to build: a machine that couldn't be intercepted, couldn't be stopped, and maybe shouldn't exist. For a moment, it worked. That was the problem. When the dust settled, politicians moved on and the desert went quiet again. The hangars were emptied, the test stands sealed off. What remained was a moral crater bigger than any hole left by the engines themselves. Humanity had looked at the atom and thought, we can make this fly. Then, halfway through doing it, we realized the planet was the launch pad and the target. The Soviet counterparts. While the US was strapping live reactors to bombers, the Soviet Union wasn't about to sit quietly on the tarmac. To them, every American experiment looked like a threat disguised as progress. If Washington chased infinite flight, Moscow would chase it faster. The result was a parallel universe of nuclear aviation hidden behind the Iron Curtain, fueled by secrecy, fear, and a belief that if an idea terrified the enemy, it had to be worth doing. The Soviet leadership viewed nuclear-powered aircraft as the next decisive leap in strategic deterrence. After all, long-range bombers were the backbone of their nuclear arsenal. The Americans had the B-36 and later the B-52. The Soviets had their own giants, the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear, the Myasishchev M50, and an array of prototypes that blurred the line between aircraft and reactor housing. Each new blueprint came with the same grand promise: infinite range, unstoppable reach, and continuous patrols over hostile skies. Each also carried an unspoken reality check. How do you tell a crew they'll be sitting a few meters from an unshielded nuclear core? By the mid-195s, the Soviet atomic aircraft project formally took shape under the NKD Research Institute and the Tupolev Design Bureau. Engineers studied U.S. experiments through thin trickles of intelligence and propaganda leaks, assuming that if America had flown a nuclear plane, they needed to do the same. Their top-secret effort aimed to outmatch the rumored American progress and prove that the USSR could literally outfly capitalism. Their most famous testbed became a modified version of the Tu-95 bomber, the same prop-driven beast that still rumbles through Russian patrols today. Known internally as the Tu-95 Lal, it served as both research platform and political statement. The acronym stood for Radioactive Atomная Laboratoria, meaning Flying Nuclear Laboratory. The plan was to install a working reactor in the bomb bay and measure radiation leakage during flight, eerily similar to what the U.S. had done with its NB-36H Crusader. The reactor itself was relatively small, but Soviet engineers dealt with the same impossible equation as their American counterparts. The more shielding you added, the more you crippled the plane's ability to fly. The solution wasn't really a solution, it was compromise disguised as confidence. The Tu-95 Lal flew numerous test missions starting in 1961, carrying an operational reactor that wasn't connected to the engines but emitted real radiation. Crews were rotated frequently, their exposure tracked quietly under classified medical programs. Publicly, the flights were successful. Privately, they raised grim questions about how much radiation one could absorb in service to the motherland. The pilots called the plane the Flying Stove. Inside, temperatures climbed uncomfortably, and despite protective walls of lead and boron, radiation levels were higher than anyone admitted in official reports. Unlike the Americans, who at least disclosed limited scraps of information to Congress, the Soviets kept an absolute lid on everything. Even families of the test crews learned only years later what kind of missions their loved ones had flown. The USSR's deeper motivation wasn't just to replicate American experiments. Soviet strategists faced geographical reality. Their territory was vast, their early warning systems unreliable, and their missile technology initially lagged behind. A nuclear-powered bomber that could stay airborne for days seemed like an elegant solution to poor infrastructure. It could loiter over ocean or tundra indefinitely, ready to retaliate if war ever went nuclear. In theory, it balanced the scale. In practice, it skirted the edge of national suicide. Parallel to those bomber tests were equally reckless ground experiments. At facilities near Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, the same site where hundreds of nuclear weapons would be tested, engineers conducted radiation trials with reactor components and airframe materials. The contamination legacy of those activities is still measurable today. Soil samples around the old test ranges show persistent isotopes from those 195's project. Local populations, mostly unaware of what was happening, began suffering mysterious illnesses that wouldn't be linked to radiation exposure until decades afterward. Yet at the time, the state's propaganda machine turned nuclear research into a symbol of strength. Soviet newsreels portrayed atomic energy as a benevolent servant of progress, lighting homes, powering icebreakers, and soon they promised fueling aircraft that would bridge continents. The same footage that thrilled citizens also masked the human cost. The engineers and soldiers stationed near radioactive sites, exposed during tests labeled routine. Admitting risk wasn't compatible with communist optimism. The message was clear: sacrifice was patriotic, questions were not. While secrecy insulated failures from public scrutiny, it also created technical blind spots. Soviet documentation shows internal arguments between Tupolev's design bureau and government physicists about how to manage reactor safety during emergency landings. One proposal suggested jettisoning the core by parachute if turbines failed. Another recommended installing a quick-release system to dump the entire reactor into the ocean. None were approved. None solved the core problem of what happens when gravity meets fission. Meanwhile, the American Project Pluto sent shockwaves through Soviet intelligence. CIA leaks hinted the US was building a nuclear-powered missile capable of endless flight. In response, the Kremlin authorized research into its own nuclear ramjet concept. Code names shifted, data vanished, but the central idea was clear. If the Americans planned to develop a flying reactor, the Soviets would too. The USSR's study teams worked at Arzamas 16, their most secret nuclear city, analyzing feasibility. They quickly reached the same grim conclusions. Yes, it could work, and no, it shouldn't. Those findings were buried in archives that wouldn't resurface until after the Soviet collapse. By the early 196s, the strain of maintaining parity across so many apocalyptic projects began to show. Resources were limited, and newer intercontinental ballistic missiles offered a simpler, cheaper way to deliver the same threat. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 renewed the sense of vulnerability within both superpowers. Suddenly, keeping nuclear bombers airborne around the clock, let alone nuclear-powered ones, felt less like strategy and more like tempting fate. Still, the fascination lingered in Moscow's upper ranks. Just as American generals romanticized technological invincibility, Soviet marshals dreamed of unstoppable endurance. If it can fly forever, one senior officer reportedly said, the enemy can never sleep. That line captured both the allure and insanity of the program. The Kremlin wanted deterrence through exhaustion, forcing humanity to live permanently under a bomber's shadow. Environmental data from later research revealed the consequences. Around Semipalatinsk, radiation from decades of bomber tests and nuclear detonations caused spikes in cancer, birth defects, and soil contamination over thousands of square kilometers. Villages downwind bore the invisible scars of progress. Soviet scientists attempted limited cleanup operations, but the scale of damage overwhelmed them. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, those radioactive areas remained among the most contaminated on Earth. Inside Russia today, the Tu-95 continues to fly, though powered only by conventional turboprops. Its endurance and silhouette serve as ghosts of the atomic ambitions that nearly turned the skies into fallout zones. Modern Russian engineers occasionally hint at reviving nuclear-propelled systems, like the Burevestnik missile, but even they reference the old Tupolev experiments as cautionary tales rather than guiding precedent. We learned what not to do, one contemporary analyst remarked dryly. Looking back, the Soviet nuclear bomber saga mirrors its American twin almost perfectly. Brilliant scientists chasing ideological fantasies, governments equating fear with power, and landscapes quietly poisoned in the process. The contest wasn't about physics, it was about psychology. Each side looked at the other's madness and called it genius. The only real difference was the color of the flag painted on the fuselage. By the mid-196s, both programs quietly wound down. Documents were sealed, reactors dismantled, crews reassigned. Official histories framed them as triumphant experiments that advanced atomic science. In truth, they were desperate flails by two nations trapped in mirror-image obsessions, convinced survival meant outradiating the rival. And hovering over it all was a shared realization neither side dared say aloud. Building the perfect weapon sometimes means perfecting your own destruction. The Soviets had chased the Americans into nuclear aviation, and both emerged haunted by the same truth. Some technologies aren't abandoned because they fail, but because they might succeed. The Cuban Missile Crisis turns the sky cold. October 1962. The world holds its breath. In a matter of days, the United States and the Soviet Union go from uneasy rivals to nuclear adversaries just 90 miles apart. Spy planes have discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba, and suddenly impossible becomes imminent. Across the globe, ordinary people scan the horizon, wondering if the next sunrise might be their last. At U.S. air bases, the Strategic Air Command scrambles into high alert. Nuclear-armed B-52s are ordered into continuous flight rotations, a deadly choreography of round-the-clock vigilance. Each aircraft carries bombs powerful enough to erase entire cities, yet their presence is somehow meant to prevent war. It's deterrence by exhaustion. Part of that fleet flies over the Atlantic, part over the Arctic, forming an airborne constellation of apocalypse. At any moment, one misunderstanding could turn contrails into extinction. Within that atmosphere of panic, nuclear-powered flight suddenly looks less like genius and more like lunacy. Imagine it, live reactors aloft amid the highest military alert in history. One crash, one mistaken radar reading, and everyone loses the gamble. Even the most enthusiastic advocates of atomic propulsion start to squirm. Inside Pentagon meeting rooms, the same generals who once dreamed of endless flight now scribble contingency plans for how to bring bombers home if communications are cut. The tone shifts from triumph to survival. The crisis begins with reconnaissance, ironically by aircraft. A U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba photographs Soviet missile launchers under construction. Those grainy black and white photos set off a chain reaction that nearly triggers global annihilation. As the U-2's images reach Washington, President Kennedy's advisors debate war, blockade, or diplomacy. Meanwhile, in the skies, the military's faith in airborne readiness solidifies. The best defense, they think, is a bomber already in the air. It's a philosophy that makes twisted sense only until you realize there are dozens of nuclear weapons circling the planet at once. During those 13 tense days, the United States climbs to DEFCON 2, the highest level of readiness ever reached short of all-out war. 56 B-52s patrol constantly, while hundreds more wait on runways for the signal to launch. Pilots sleep in their flight suits, engines idling outside their barracks. Every radar blip sets hearts pounding. Across the ocean, Soviet bomber crews stand by inside dimly lit hangars, fueled by equal parts caffeine and fear. Both sides have their fingers centimeters from history's edge. On October 27, it almost happens. Another U-2, flown by Major Rudolf Anderson, drifts into Cuban airspace and vanishes from radar. He's shot down by a Soviet missile battery. In Washington, Kennedy's military advisors argue to strike back, bomb the sites, maybe invade Cuba outright. But cooler heads intervene. One retaliatory raid could unleash the chain reaction everyone dreads. Anderson becomes the Cold War's unseen martyr, his death quietly preventing millions more. That day, Black Saturday, as it's later called, becomes the turning point. Nuclear bombers still circle overhead, yet for the first time, their existence feels unbearable. Leaders glimpse the reality behind their strategy. One slip of human judgment could vaporize civilization. The idea of adding nuclear reactors to those same aircraft now looks grotesque. Even the Air Force's internal memos adopt a somber tone. Efficiency statistics give way to phrases like escalation management and crisis stability. When the standoff finally eases, everyone exhales at once, but something fundamental has changed. The romance of atomic aviation, with its promises of infinite range and technological daring, dies in the same breath as the illusion of control. The Cuban Missile Crisis exposes how fragile command truly is. Communications jammed, orders misread, tempers flaring, those are bad enough with conventional bombers. Add reactors glowing at 40,000 feet and the risk becomes indefensible. The lesson lands hard. In post-crisis debriefings, military analysts conclude that maximum readiness nearly triggered the catastrophe it was meant to prevent. Constantly airborne nuclear forces sound strong in theory, but in practice, they push civilization to a hair's breadth from collapse. If an ordinary bomber patrol can almost end the world, what hope is there for machines that never land? Suddenly, the nuclear airplane feels like the punchline to a joke nobody's laughing at. Politicians sense it too. Public fear has reached a fever pitch. Newspaper headlines scream about fallout shelters and war readiness. Nobody wants to hear about atomic engines now. Congressional enthusiasm for fantastical projects cools overnight. The age of nuclear everything, cars, rockets, planes, starts to look like a dangerous delusion. Behind closed doors, funding begins to shift from visible, spectacular weapons to hidden ones. Intercontinental ballistic missiles that don't rely on human pilots or airborne reactors. Silent destruction feels safer than noisy innovation. Soviet leaders draw the same conclusion, though they can't admit it publicly. The Cuban disaster proves that command and control failures are the real enemy. The Kremlin's generals see their bomber squadrons nearly launched on false alerts and quietly shelve nuclear plane ambitions soon after. Deterrence, they realize, doesn't require infinite flight. It requires surviving one more day than the other side. Out of these close calls emerges something paradoxically hopeful: communication. The hotline, installed between Washington and Moscow after the crisis, isn't a symbol of friendship, it's a survival mechanism. For the first time, both sides acknowledge they can't live in a world that runs on permanent tension. Direct communication promises to prevent another silent countdown like the one Black Saturday nearly became. The crisis also rewrites military doctrine. Instead of building the biggest or strangest machines possible, strategists start prioritizing redundancy and restraint. They study what almost went wrong: airplanes misidentified as missiles, misheard orders, overzealous commanders ready to strike without clearance. In that introspection lies the unofficial end of nuclear aviation as a serious pursuit. Its logic collapses under the weight of common sense rediscovered too late. For the engineers who had devoted their lives to atomic propulsion, the shift feels like whiplash. 1 year earlier, their project symbolized progress. Now the same laboratories echo with unease. Congressional oversight committees begin asking uncomfortable questions about safety implications in the event of confrontation. Translation: we almost ended the world last week. Tell us why your flying reactor wouldn't make that worse. As the early 196s give way to mid-decade pragmatism, defense spending redirects toward missiles submerged underwater or buried in silos. Bombers remain vital, but the fantasies of eternal flight fade. Even experimental aerospace programs, those half-joking reactor gliders and atomic drones, start disappearing from budget drafts. Engineers sense the changing tide. What was once patriotic ambition now sounds reckless in every newspaper headline. In hindsight, the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't just a historical event, it's the world's collective moment of sobriety. For 15 years, both superpowers ran on the thrill of unstoppable progress. Suddenly, they see how fragile progress is when built on paranoia. The same skies once imagined as pathways to infinite power now feel claustrophobic, echoing with the engines of bombers that nearly destroyed everything. Nothing kills a dream faster than reality. And for nuclear flight, reality came in the shape of two superpowers staring into mutual extinction. After Cuba, no one could look at a glowing reactor and see the future. It looked too much like the past repeating itself. The world learned that being able to fly forever doesn't matter if there's nowhere left to land. The human and environmental fallout. By the time both superpowers realized their race for nuclear flight had hit a dead end, the damage had already leaked beyond laboratories and hangars. The Cold War's most radioactive dreams left real scars on real people, scientists, soldiers, and entire communities that didn't even know they were part of an experiment. The tragedy wasn't a single catastrophic meltdown. It was a slow-motion chain reaction of secrecy and negligence that spread across decades and continents. In the American Southwest, the aircraft nuclear propulsion program had left more than paperwork behind. Test ranges in Idaho and New Mexico housed reactors that had run hot, releasing trace amounts of radioactive gas during experiments. The contamination was officially classified as minimal, a comforting word stretched across dozens of pages of reports full of missing numbers. Engineers later admitted that filters designed to capture fission byproducts didn't always work. Wind carried microscopic particles across the desert. Locals were told the glowing lights on the horizon were just routine engine tests. Most communities near these sites believed it. In the 195s, nuclear power still sounded noble. The government insisted it was as safe as sunshine. Farmers kept working fields downwind of research facilities. Children played outside while clouds of fine dust drifted overhead. Years later, some of those same regions would record higher than average cancer and thyroid illness rates, though linking them conclusively remained impossible. Records conveniently vanished, and witnesses signed classified acknowledgments. Inside the programs, safety culture was equally fragile. Laboratory technicians routinely handled radioactive instruments without realizing the cumulative doses they were receiving. Film badges, the little plastic cards meant to track exposure, often went unread or were replaced only during inspections. Some engineers joked that if your badge turned black before payday, you deserved hazard pay. The laughter didn't age well. Radiation sickness doesn't happen in a day. It builds quietly, like a debt that never forgets. Across the ocean, the Soviet story was darker still. Their test sites weren't hidden in barren deserts but near populated steppes of Kazakhstan. The Semipalatinsk range became the heart of the USSR's nuclear experimentation, more than 450 detonations, hundreds of bomber exercises, and uncounted materials exposure tests. Project documents disguised the site's emissions as agricultural data. Villagers living within a few dozen kilometers were given pamphlets about unusual weather conditions. In reality, they were inhaling fallout. For those communities, the human toll unfolded slowly. Livestock births dropped. Children developed immune disorders no doctor could explain. Decades later, medical researchers studying the region found genetic damage spanning multiple generations. A grandmother who remembered watching orange light on the horizon in 1958 might now hold a grandchild born with cancer. When Soviet archives opened in the 199s, maps showed contamination zones larger than some European countries. Portions of the steppe are still uninhabitable today. The pilots and support crews didn't fare better. Both superpowers portrayed them as heroes, but the heroism came with invisible costs. In the US, members of the NB-36H flights were monitored for radiation exposure years after the program's end. Some received quiet medical compensation. Others received form letters thanking them for classified contributions. In the Soviet Union, surviving members of the 295 LAL tests rarely spoke publicly, even after the USSR collapsed. Those who did described recurring illnesses, leukemia, bone deterioration, strange rashes that never healed. There were no medals for that kind of endurance. What kept all this hidden wasn't malice so much as momentum. Cold War secrecy operated on the belief that national security outweighed individual suffering. Reporting an accident risked embarrassment. A contaminated worker became paperwork, not a person. Everything within limits became the scientific way to say, don't ask. The result was an unrecorded collective experiment on what happens when fear and pride override ethics. By the early 196s, even military planners began grasping the environmental insanity. Project Pluto's reactor tests were particularly problematic. Each run at Jackass Flats released radioactive exhaust despite filtration systems. On calm days, the plume wafted harmlessly into the sky. On windy days, it didn't. Scientists near the site developed meticulous cleaning rituals, washing shoes before returning home, sealing clothes in plastic bins. Yet traces of contamination still spread, and birds migrating through the area turned up with elevated isotope counts. Nature became an unwilling witness to atomic ambition. The Soviets mirrored this contamination on a grander scale. Around Semipalatinsk, atmospheric tests carved radioactive scars into the soil. Water tables absorbed cesium and strontium that persist today. Attempts to bury waste beneath concrete failed as groundwater seeped upward. When locals protested sickness clusters, officials sent research teams that published censored findings, short reports concluding everything was within acceptable deviation. One Kazakh doctor later wrote that officials redefined acceptable to mean whatever allowed testing to continue. Meanwhile, public perception back home remained blissfully optimistic. American families bought atomic-age appliances, while propaganda films showed clean-cut scientists pouring glowing liquids labeled progress. In the Soviet Union, posters depicted smiling engineers standing under stylized reactor domes. Nuclear power meant pride and prosperity, not hazard. It took decades and a handful of visible accidents before either society admitted that radiation doesn't care about ideology. Within scientific circles, guilt accumulated quietly. Some of the brightest engineers who had once treated radiation as a problem of geometry, how many inches of shielding, how many millisieverts, began seeing it as something personal. Letters from former Project Pluto staff describe recurring nightmares of aircraft crashing into cities, reactors scattering ash over playgrounds. "We convinced ourselves it would never happen," one wrote years later, "but we'd already let it happen, just slower." Environmental agencies that formed later had to map exposures without full data. Cleanup teams returning to old test sites found buried components still hot, sometimes reading thousands of counts per minute. Entire hangars were dismantled piece by piece, trucked to remote burial pits. Jackass Flats itself became part of the Nevada National Security Site, accessible only with radiation badges and a sense of historical irony. The landscape looked peaceful, but Geiger counters told another story. one of invisible residue humming softly beneath the sand. The smallest human details often reveal the biggest tragedies. In one American town near a reactor lab, dogs were found with trace strontium in their teeth. Schoolchildren had higher iodine isotopes in milk samples. At the time, officials brushed off concerns, citing normal background variation. The families never knew those numbers matched fallout readings from tests nearly 100 miles away. Science had boundaries, but government patience for bad publicity did not. The Soviets, unable to acknowledge public exposure, simply erased towns off maps. Residents of contaminated villages were relocated with vague explanations about military necessity. Decades later, aerial surveys revealed entire ghost communities inside exclusion zones, streets overgrown, buildings melted by time, radiation still detectable on the playground swings. The population's loss was both physical and historical. Even memory was classified. For the people who served in these projects, the personal reckoning came late. Many took pride in their technological achievements but struggled with what those machines represented. A nuclear aircraft wasn't just dangerous, it blurred moral lines between weapon and environment. It turned the sky into collateral damage. Some scientists later joined environmental activism movements, campaigning for cleanup funding or public transparency. Their transformation, from cold warriors to environmental witnesses, became an unspoken epilogue to the nuclear age. Even now, the ghost of those programs still hums quietly beneath policy debates. Whenever a new microreactor design promises safe portable power, veterans of ANP or Semipalatinsk remind the next generation that safety isn't just a design threshold, it's a moral one. The technology itself isn't evil, the secrecy and recklessness are. Measure twice, one old engineer quipped, then check your conscience. Radiation has no ideology. It doesn't know borders, party lines, or patriotism. The fallout from the nuclear airplane projects didn't just settle on desert soil or Kazakh plains, it settled into collective memory, a warning written in isotopes. Environmental damage can fade, but the lesson shouldn't. Ambition without empathy is contamination by another name. By the end of the 196s, both nations were quietly cleaning up their literal and moral messes. Funding for remediation trickled slowly, buried under new priorities. The world turned its gaze toward rockets, space, and other dreams that reached upward instead of burning everything below. Yet under every launch pad and missile silo lay the remnants of an earlier chapter when humanity thought it could turn annihilation into propulsion. The Cold War began as an ideological struggle and ended as a toxic inheritance. Scientists learned what politicians wouldn't admit, that progress built on paranoia leaves its mark long after the headlines fade. The land heals slowly, but memory even slower. And somewhere in those empty deserts and silent steppes, Geiger counters still click, a steady reminder that some experiments never truly end. Why it finally died? By the mid-196s, the dream of atomic flight had developed the same symptoms as the reactors themselves, unstable, overheated, and on the verge of meltdown. For nearly 15 years, engineers, generals, and politicians had sworn that nuclear propulsion would change everything. What it really changed was their patience. Mountains of money disappeared into laboratories that produced beautiful blueprints, and nothing anyone could safely fly. Even optimism has half-life, and by 1964, it was decaying fast. Inside the Pentagon, every meeting about the aircraft nuclear propulsion program began to sound like déjà vu. The same charts, the same promises, then the same quiet admissions that shielding weight made the concept unworkable. For a single bomber to carry the necessary protection, it would have to defy both physics and common sense. Engineers joked that if they built it strong enough to survive its reactor, it wouldn't have enough thrust to leave the ground. Each calculation proved the same grim truth. The plane could fly, or it could be safe, but never both. Costs ballooned. The Atomic Energy Commission's quarterly reports described funding irregularities that translated to billions in contemporary value. The Air Force began cutting other research programs just to keep the nuclear project breathing. Even that didn't stop the bleeding. Construction of hardened test facilities in Idaho and Nevada consumed resources equal to an entire wing of conventional bombers. Members of Congress who once cheered the atomic age of aviation started grumbling about runaway science spending. When budgets shrink, enthusiasm evaporates. Safety, or the lack of it, sealed the project's fate. Every test raised new questions no answer could calm. What if the plane crashed? What if it had to ditch at sea? Could terrorists, or just curious teenagers, salvage a reactor core from the wreck? The theoretical worst-case scenarios read like horror fiction. Analysts estimated that one accident over populated territory might contaminate hundreds of square miles. The Air Force's own risk assessment compared possible fallout levels to multiple full-scale bomb detonations spread across rural zones. Translation: one pilot error could make Kansas glow. Engineers protested that the chances of such a crash were statistically low. Politicians countered that statistics don't decontaminate farmland. By then, the nation had already witnessed partial reactor mishaps at research sites, and television viewers were growing weary of phrases like minimal exposure. Public opinion, though never asked directly, had shifted sharply. Nuclear power meant submarines and electricity, not planes that shed particles as they flew. Letters to newspapers questioned why anyone needed a bomber that could stay aloft for weeks when intercontinental ballistic missiles could hit targets in minutes. It was a fair question, and one the Air Force couldn't answer without admitting the project's irrelevance. Behind closed doors, even the program's champions began losing faith. General Curtis LeMay, the fiery advocate who had once demanded aircraft that can outlast the enemy's nerves, quietly redirected focus toward missile forces. ICBMs were cheaper, faster, and critically, didn't require strapping nuclear reactors to aluminum airframes. Submarines with nuclear engines already provided endurance safely underwater. Repeating that trick in the sky no longer made sense. The era of spectacular aviation projects was giving way to quiet deterrence buried in silos or beneath the sea. By 1963, internal memos carried the scent of resignation disguised as progress. Technical summaries highlighted significant breakthroughs pending that never arrived. Contractors padded schedules with optimistic milestones. In practice, little moved except the paperwork. Laboratories ran smaller and smaller tests, reactor elements glowing for a few minutes before being shut down due to unexpected flux variations. Everyone knew those words meant radiation leak. Officially, the project remained full of potential. Unofficially, it had become political dynamite. Then came the final blow: publicity. Journalists who specialized in defense reporting caught wind of the immense costs and mounting dangers. One article hinted that the Air Force was testing airborne reactors over populated areas, which wasn't entirely true, but close enough to rattle nerves on Capitol Hill. Environmental campaigners, just beginning to find their post-war voice, demanded explanations about waste disposal. For the first time, senators requested detailed safety figures instead of patriotic slogans. Those hearings marked a turning point. The conversation shifted from "can we build it?" to "why on earth are we still trying?" The scientists themselves were divided. Many had grown attached to the technical challenge, seeing it as a problem worth solving regardless of purpose. Others felt the creeping absurdity. Several senior physicists at Oak Ridge and Los Alamos privately lobbied for cancellation, arguing that nuclear aviation had reached a point of diminishing returns and escalating moral debt. One memo summed it up bluntly: further success would constitute failure by demonstration. In other words, proving the concept would simply prove our irresponsibility. Pressure from within coincided with a broader cultural shift. The Cuban Missile Crisis had shattered the illusion that technological superiority guaranteed safety. The world had come a hair's breadth from nuclear war because of human mistakes, not technological gaps. In that sobering aftermath, the idea of adding even more reactors to the sky seemed obscene. Military planners began emphasizing crisis stability over absolute dominance. Stability meant predictability, and nuclear airplanes were anything but predictable. Internationally, new treaties further constrained the fantasy. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited atmospheric nuclear tests. That legally crippled any future flight trials, since every engine run spewed radioactive exhaust. What had once been a patriotic experiment now technically violated international law. The lawyers didn't need to debate long. Funding the impossible became indefensible. In early 1964, the official budgets arrived on the president's desk. The numbers didn't inspire confidence. More than $1 billion already spent, no operable aircraft, and several test reactors sitting idle under guard. President Johnson's defense advisors recommended program consolidation, bureaucraties for burial. On July 1, 1964, both the aircraft nuclear propulsion project and its monstrous offspring, Project Pluto, were formally shut down. The press release cited changing strategic priorities. The engineers translated that as sanity regained. Cancellation wasn't a ceremony, it was a whimper. Laboratories were ordered to seal experimental cores in concrete casks. Classified binders filled with radiation data were placed in vaults marked obsolete. Skilled technicians scattered into the growing civilian nuclear power industry, taking with them experience in heat transfer and materials science that would later help build safe energy reactors. Civilian applications became the polite cover story. Nobody wanted to admit they'd spent a decade designing Doomsday engines. For the crews and scientists, emotions were tangled. Relief mingled with disappointment. Many had risked their health chasing what they thought was the future of flight. Their success had been technical, but their purpose nonsensical. Closure felt anticlimactic. One engineer recalled the day security trucks arrived to collect equipment. We watched them haul the reactor away like a dead pet. Others refused to talk about it at all, burying their involvement under layers of classified silence. Politicians conveniently forgot the episode. Speeches celebrating America's scientific leadership skipped over the atomic airplane chapter. Even military museums hesitated to display artifacts. The idea was too absurd for nostalgia and too grim for pride. The NB-H's lead-lined cockpit ended up in storage, a relic of ambition heavy enough to sink its own myth. Only historians decades later would piece together how close humanity came to turning the sky into a nuclear testing ground. Yet, like everything nuclear, the idea never decayed entirely. A small group of engineers preserved their research notebooks, convinced the science might one day serve something nobler, perhaps deep space propulsion, where radiation wasn't a neighborly problem. In that limited sense, the failure still yielded progress. But within military aviation, the curtain had fallen. The atom would stay on ships and submarines, not wings. Looking back, the death of the nuclear plane was less a decision than an awakening. Cost, danger, legality, and sheer exhaustion finally aligned against fantasy. It wasn't one dramatic disaster that killed the project. It was the steady realization that avoiding disaster required not building it. The experiment had lasted long enough to prove its own absurdity. When the final reports were filed away, one closing line appeared in multiple memos. No further work recommended at this time. This time became forever. The aircraft nuclear propulsion program faded quietly, and with it, the dream of endless flight powered by fear. The era of radioactive optimism was grounded for good. Humanity had stared at the sky, imagined infinite power, and then, in a rare moment of collective sanity, decided to stop chasing it before the dust began to glow. Resurfacing ambitions and modern echoes. For a few decades, nuclear flight seemed buried deep in the vaults of Cold War absurdity. Then quietly, the whispers came back. Around conference tables and in classified briefings, the question emerged again: what if we've solved the old problems? What if nuclear propulsion wasn't madness anymore, just misunderstood too soon? By the 21st century, the dream of a reactor in the sky began flickering back to life, powered this time by miniaturization and selective amnesia. In the 200s, defense researchers started chasing what they called microreactor technology, tiny, supposedly portable fission systems built to power remote bases. On paper, these reactors were safe, clean, and sealed inside containers barely larger than a refrigerator. The same breakthroughs that made them possible also reignited old fantasies. If you could fit a generator for a battlefield inside a truck, why not inside an aircraft? The imagination of weapons designers is like radiation. Once unleashed, it's hard to contain. Lockheed Martin briefly captured headlines when patents for a compact fusion reactor surfaced. The company claimed it could produce 100 megawatts of power, enough to run a city, while small enough to fit inside an F-16's fuselage. The promise was intoxicating: no meltdown risk, no long-lived waste, and a fuel supply measured in pounds per year. Articles speculated about fusion-powered jets cruising indefinitely above the clouds. To skeptics, it sounded familiar. The same confidence had filled press releases back when engineers were bolting uranium cores into bombers. The difference was vocabulary. Limitless clean power replaced unlimited nuclear deterrence. Different century, same temptation. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Russia resurrected a ghost. In the late 200s, President Vladimir Putin unveiled a missile called the 9M730 Burevestnik, known to NATO as Skyfall. Official statements described it as a nuclear-powered cruise missile with effectively infinite range. Western analysts immediately recognized the echo of Project Pluto. Even the description felt copied from a 196's Air Force brochure. A weapon that could fly beneath radar for days, evade defenses, then strike from any direction on Earth. Satellite images later confirmed test activity at Arctic sites suspiciously similar to the old American desert ranges. If the reports are accurate, Burevestnik carries a small, unshielded reactor feeding a ramjet engine, precisely the technology that made Project Pluto infamous. Several tests between 2017 and 2019 reportedly failed disastrously, one of them ending with a radioactive explosion off Russia's north coast that killed multiple scientists. Official statements framed it as a liquid fuel accident. Independent monitors detected iodine-131 isotopes in the air weeks later. The Cold War hadn't just left relics, it had left instructions, and someone had decided to follow them. To Russian military planners, the appeal is the same as in the 195s. Endurance equals invulnerability. A missile that never needs refueling sounds like perfect deterrence. But to international observers, the thought of a flying reactor crossing countries uninvited sounds like global roulette. Environmental organizations likened Burevestnik to Chernobyl with a flight plan. Even among scientists, the idea divides opinion. Some see it as strategic theater, others as evidence that the logic of fear still holds sway. In the United States, fascination returns in more cautious forms. The Department of Defense funds Project Pluto, a mobile microreactor program promising rapid deployment for remote bases, not aircraft, at least not yet. Engineers insist the lessons of AMP were learned: new materials, better shielding, safer shutdowns. But the conversation inevitably drifts to mobility, endurance, autonomy. Every technological advance nudges imagination closer to the sky again. Comments at aerospace conferences flirt lightly with nuclear-powered drones or orbital vehicles. Purely theoretical, they say, the same phrase their predecessors used. Public awareness lags decades behind the research. For most people, nuclear airplanes remain trivia from documentaries or conspiracy forums. The average citizen doesn't realize that several nations still explore nuclear propulsion under different branding: advanced energy systems, high-density power cycles. The rebranding works. Nuclear now hides behind acronyms. Politicians reassure audiences that safety standards are modern, forgetting that ambition doesn't age out of risk. A reactor crash still means the same thing it did in 1964. Contamination, chaos, denial. The ethical questions resurface with eerie familiarity. Does potential deterrence justify spreading radiation through the atmosphere? Can any reactor small enough for flight be safe enough to crash? Advocates argue that uncrewed designs eliminate human vulnerability. Critics point out that removing humans merely removes conscience. Machines don't panic, but they also don't feel guilt. A drone doesn't hesitate when automatized errors send it spiraling into populated airspace. Technology advances, morality idles. Among historians, these echoes are equal parts fascinating and depressing. They see in every new limitless endurance project a kind of intellectual déjà vu. Papers at defense symposia cite legacy experiments from the mid-20th century, meaning the programs once buried for being too dangerous to mention aloud. The same diagrams reappear, now in digital color. Lines representing radioactive exhaust look smoother, but the endpoints are unchanged. The old lesson refuses to die, because pride keeps reviving it. There's also nostalgia involved. Engineers who grew up on stories of heroic inventors see themselves continuing that lineage, the frontier spirit without the mushroom clouds. Fusion, they insist, will be different, and maybe it will be. If humanity ever cracks controlled fusion in a device smaller than a bus, safe aviators might finally ride on plasma instead of fumes. But maybe is still a bet, one humanity has historically placed recklessly. When optimism meets weapons research, the odds rarely favor restraint. Some of the same motivations that fueled Project Pluto quietly persist: prestige, deterrence, and the fear of falling behind. Geopolitics still rewards spectacle. A country announcing a reactor-powered missile commands attention even if the claim remains speculative. That's the real danger, not that these systems already exist, but that belief in them drives spending and posturing. The mythology of infinite power keeps competing empires alive long after the laboratory prototypes have rusted. Environmental concerns complicate the picture. climate change has revived interest in nuclear energy as low-carbon power, which softens public resistance to anything labeled nuclear. It's a short step from celebrating zero-emission reactors on the ground to tolerating them in the sky. Yet scientists who study radiation biology warn against casual optimism. Reactors don't care whether they're green. The particles released during a malfunction remain just as carcinogenic under eco-friendly labels. Tomorrow's headlines could sound suspiciously like yesterday's footnotes. When journalists asked former Cold War engineers what they thought of these modern revivals, many responded with weary bemusement. "Let them try," one said, "and maybe they'll rediscover all the reasons we stopped." Another pointed out that materials may improve, regulations may tighten, but politics doesn't evolve nearly as quickly. "As soon as someone says the enemy can't shoot it down," he sighed, "we're right back where we were." Still, not all echoes are ominous. Some research derived from the old programs genuinely serves peaceful goals. NASA studies small nuclear engines for deep space exploration. Those environments, devoid of atmosphere and civilians, make radiation far less risky. In space, infinite endurance finally fits its moral context. Ironically, the technology once designed to threaten worlds might someday help reach them. The duality is classic human behavior, tinkering at the edge of apocalypse until we find some way to call it progress. For now, the nuclear sky remains theoretical, but the conversation keeps orbiting back. The mere possibility exerts gravitational pull. Every generation of engineers encounters the same paradox. Fear drives innovation, and innovation tempts fear back into relevance. The world that canceled nuclear flight half a century ago now toys with its descendants, convinced this time will be safer. Perhaps it will, perhaps it won't. What's certain is that the story refuses to end. Each new announcement, from fusion patents to mysterious Russian tests, adds another layer of radiation to our imagination. We dig up blueprints, polish the warnings, and call them inspiration. History doesn't repeat perfectly, but it rhymes in isotopes. The lesson lingers in the background hum of every reactor, modern or ancient. Progress is easy to measure in watts, harder to measure in wisdom. When you listen closely, the past still murmurs beneath today's ambitions. It sounds a lot like turbines spooling up over the desert, a low metallic roar promising endless flight. Only now we know better, or at least we should. If the nuclear airplane once symbolized mankind's worst impulse to conquer the sky at any cost, its reappearance reminds us that forgetting is the most dangerous form of invention. The future might not glow, but it still hums, quietly, insistently, just waiting for someone to turn the switch back on. What the nuclear plane teaches us about ourselves. So what does the story of the nuclear airplane actually reveal about us? The creatures who thought flying reactors were a good idea. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity from a safe distance. Engineers sketching doomsday engines, politicians funding them with patriotic slogans, scientists debating how much radiation a pilot could safely absorb before lunch. But beneath the madness lies a strangely human pattern. Every great technological gamble doubles as a psychological portrait of its time. When nations chase impossible machines, they're usually chasing reassurance. The nuclear plane was never really about flight, it was about fear. It began as a desperate promise that the United States could stay one step ahead of annihilation. If bombers could stay aloft forever, the country could sleep. That illusion of control mattered more than logic. The Soviets mirrored the same impulse from the opposite side of the Iron Curtain, convinced an airborne reactor guaranteed equality with America's arsenal. Infinite range became shorthand for safety, proof that whoever built the bigger nightmare could prevent their own. That way, the atomic airplane was the purest Cold War creation. It blended brilliance with helplessness. Brilliant because scientists genuinely solved problems no one had attempted: miniature reactors, exotic materials, whole branches of thermodynamics. Hopeless because all that genius served a goal shaped by paranoia. The greatest minds of a generation weren't exploring space or curing disease. They were engineering a way to keep apocalypse airborne just in case the rival blinked first. It's tempting to judge that mindset as insanity unique to the 195s, but the same reflex still lives quietly in modern innovation. Every time humanity confronts existential fear, be it war, climate, or extinction, we respond with invention before reflection. We build before asking why. The nuclear bomber simply made that reflex spectacularly literal. Weaponized insecurity wrapped in stainless steel, climbing toward some unreachable reassurance. Consider the symbolism. a machine meant to fly endlessly without landing, powered by the process that ended World War II, its technological poetry about refusing to rest until the next disaster arrives. In chasing infinite endurance, both superpowers exposed their finite trust. The nuclear plane wasn't a tool of exploration, it was a symptom of anxiety pretending to be progress. At its heart, the project shows how fear and curiosity often share the same laboratory. Every Cold War engineer genuinely believed they were advancing science. Many were. Radiation shielding concepts, high-temperature alloys, and airflow modeling all evolved because of those experiments. But motives matter. Their discoveries came chained to an arms race whose logic was survival through constant threat. It's proof that innovation can thrive under paranoia, yet never with peace of mind. The story also captures our species' recurring overconfidence, the belief that intelligence equals wisdom. The engineers who built the NB-36H knew precisely how radiation works down to the neutron count. What they didn't calculate was moral gravity. They could measure exposure but not consequence. When you turn fear into math, it starts to feel tame. Numbers make disaster look manageable, and that illusion fuels every leap off the ethical cliff. Look deeper and you find something even stranger. The dream of infinite flight came from the same emotional root as the dream of immortality. Both promise freedom from limits, and both ignore the responsibility that comes with endurance. An airplane that never lands sounds triumphant until you realize it also never rests. It becomes trapped in its own perfection, circling forever because stopping means dying. Every Cold War nation projected that same anxiety, the terror of landing first. Politically, the nuclear plane represents the ultimate arms race paradox. Each side built monsters to avoid using them, trusting technology to handle what diplomacy couldn't. The louder the engines, the quieter the communication. Only near mistakes like the Cuban Missile Crisis reminded everyone that machines don't negotiate. Humanity needed a panic attack visible from orbit to rediscover restraint. Emotionally, the project's lesson is humbling. Progress isn't morally neutral, it mirrors the intentions behind it. The same nuclear science that powered ships and future spacecraft nearly contaminated the sky because its sponsors demanded dominance instead of wisdom. The atom itself didn't change, only our purpose did. The failure of the nuclear airplane wasn't technical, it was philosophical. It proved that some frontiers test character more than engineering. There's also a cultural layer. During the Cold War, speed, power, and size symbolized virtue. Bigger rockets meant stronger nations, faster bombers meant safer citizens. The nuclear plane amplified that logic until it broke. You can't out-design fear. Every dollar spent chasing invincibility was really spent convincing voters they were still ahead. The result was a masterpiece of technology divorced from meaning, a metal mirror reflecting human insecurity at Mach 3. Even now, the fascination lingers because it flatters us. The idea that we nearly built a flying reactor feels outrageous, yet part of us admires the audacity. There's comfort in thinking, look how far we pushed. But audacity without empathy isn't courage, it's denial dressed as ambition. The same instinct drives explorers, inventors, and leaders. The need to be first, even when the finish line leads off a cliff. Every blueprint from the AMP program tells the same silent story in equations and stress diagrams. Each calculation assumes success before considering consequence. That's not carelessness, it's hope weaponized. Scientists are at their core optimists. They believe problems exist to be solved. The trouble comes when fear sponsors the optimism. Then every solution becomes an excuse not to feel powerless. The nuclear plane was a way to outfly vulnerability itself. What's remarkable is how the lesson still repeats. Replace uranium with artificial intelligence or genetic engineering, and the questions stay the same. How much control is enough? Who cleans up if we crash? Can we stop ourselves from building what shouldn't exist simply because we can? History suggests we can't, not easily. Human imagination accelerates faster than caution. We're brilliant at assembling power and awkward at admitting limit. Maybe that's the quiet truth behind the atomic aircraft saga. Progress and peril are twins. Each invention that protects us also tempts us. The Cold War forced humanity to invent technologies capable of ending life in order to preserve it. The nuclear plane condensed that irony into one object, an airplane designed to make survival depend on constant risk. It took 15 years and billions of dollars for civilization to realize the contradiction staring back from its own cockpit window. Yet there's redemption hidden in the wreckage. The same society that built the nightmare also had enough collective sense to ground it. That matters. It proves self-correction is possible, even after obsession runs wild. Humanity can glance over the abyss, admire the engineering, and still choose not to jump. The cancellation of nuclear flight might be one of history's rare examples of technological humility, a moment when saying no was the bravest innovation available. Ultimately, the nuclear plane tells a story not of machines but of motives. It reminds us that progress isn't measured by how far we can go, but by when we decide to stop. Endless flight was never about distance, it was about denying fear of falling. And the day those bombers returned to Earth, humanity rediscovered something strangely grounding. Sometimes the sanest decision is to land. So in hindsight, the dream of infinite flight was really about infinite fear, dressed in aluminum and optimism. It teaches that brilliance without restraint can glow as dangerously as any reactor. Every generation will face its version of the same question: how much are we willing to risk to feel safe? The answer, if we're wise, should always begin with memory of a time when the sky almost became radioactive proof that we'd mistaken survival for victory. The race for nuclear flight ended quietly, with programs sealed and reactors entombed, but its glow still lingers in history. For 15 years, two superpowers tried to turn fear into propulsion and almost succeeded. What they built was less an airplane than a mirror, one reflecting the human urge to master everything, no matter the risk. Cancellation didn't erase the ambition, it only grounded it long enough for reason to catch up. The legacy survives wherever technology outruns judgment. It's a reminder that invention always carries the shadow of intention, and progress without conscience drifts toward peril at supersonic speed. Even now, when new limitless engines are announced, those old contrails of paranoia still drift across the horizon, whispering lessons written in half-life. The dream of endless flight proved that technical mastery means nothing without moral altitude. Humanity learned the hard way that not every frontier is meant to be conquered. Some exist only to test whether we can resist crossing them. The nuclear plane never truly flew, but the warning it left behind still soars. Knowledge can lift us higher than fear if we keep our hands steady on the throttle. If you want more true Cold War stories that sound impossible until you realize they almost happened, watch our next episode. Subscribe for more astonishing tales of when human brilliance met blind ambition and nearly made the sky radioactive in the name of progress.